Valley fever has been a problem for prisoners' health, especially in California, ever since a prisoner was treated in Folsom Prison in 1919. But what has made it such a problem in 2013 that so-called high-risk prisoners are being removed from the Pleasant Valley and Avenal penitentiaries? As a co-founder of Valley Fever Survivor, I have heard from many people involved in the prisons in the endemic area. Inmates, staff, guards, chaplains, families, and even prison construction crew members. I've been told that copies of my book, Valley Fever Epidemic, are circulating in Taft, Avenal, Pleasant Valley State Prison, and others. The prison population in California was already experiencing a higher rate of valley fever infection in places like Pleasant Valley State Prison earlier in the decade. In fact, from 2002 to 2007, the infections at Pleasant Valley typically represented between half to three-quarters of all reported infections in Fresno County overall. There were quite a few valley fever-related deaths within the prison walls and after inmates were released. Over the next few years, the epidemic of valley fever, both inside and outside the prison walls, continued to get worse in unexpected ways. At least one reported case has shown donated organs from a prisoner infected with valley fever went to organ transplant recipients. The organs were not fully inspected for valley fever infection and caused death and sickness in recipients outside of prison walls. But I would suspect it was the 2012 victory of Taft Correctional Institute inmate Arjang Panah that got the most attention from the powers that be. Panah was sent to serve his sentence in 2005, but caught valley fever before his release. He was still dealing with valley fever's effects when released in 2008, and since that time faced mounting medical expenses and time away from work with lost wages. Panah sued for $2.5 million. The Department of Justice didn't admit any wrongdoing by incarcerating him in a valley fever endemic zone, but gave him $425,000 on August 1, 2012, to settle the case out of court. This payout may have come because there is a unique duty to protect people who are brought into areas against their will by the state. There must have been a realization that if one federal prisoner were able to sue, an avalanche of other infected prisoners would realize they could sue. Settling out of court would be a handy way of avoiding a precedent-setting ruling. It is not without precedent to move prisoners either. After all, since World War II, captured Germans in Florence, Arizona were moved because they were contracting valley fever, and Nazi Germany, of all the places that would be concerned with human rights, invoked the Geneva Convention to have the prisoners moved. Incidentally, there are no plans to remove current prisoners outside the state of Arizona, where 66% of valley fever cases are contracted in its own ongoing epidemic. But which prisoners are the California Department of Corrections moving now? Not everyone, only those deemed to be at high risk. But what is high risk? Certainly people with immune system problems, but these people will always be more susceptible to any disease. Certain ethnicities, such as people of Filipino heritage, are statistically shown to be at higher risk per capita, including a 30% increase for Latinos and a 90% increased risk factor for African Americans, specifically those incarcerated at these prisons. But when looking at overall caseloads, it is still Caucasians who suffer the most from valley fever in the general public. One possible risk factor might be the new construction. To comply with court orders against overcrowding, then-Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger began $7.9 billion in new prison construction. Churning up the dirt where a soil-borne fungal parasite lives is just bound to create new infections, no matter what dust control measures are applied. If the decision to remove prisoners from these areas was due to valley fever risk groups, that would ignore the fact that anyone, at any health level, could suffer a severe or fatal case of valley fever. California State Medical Receiver J. Clark Kelso observed that the state of California has known since 2006 that segments of the inmate population were at a greater risk for contracting valley fever, and mitigation efforts undertaken by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to date have proven ineffective. Immediate steps are necessary to prevent further loss of life. Don Spector, director of the Prison Law Office, put it in even stronger terms, also assigning blame to Governor Brown. The governor has said the prison system isn't crowded, and it's providing the finest healthcare system that money can buy. Here's another example why that isn't true. Prisoners are dying because they're in a toxic environment, which causes serious illness and death on a regular basis. The department has known about this problem since about 2007 and has done virtually nothing. Other risk factors include age and status of other diseases like diabetes. But what does a risk factor really mean? 45% of a Navy SEAL squad training Coalinga, California were infected, and those infected were not in any risk group. The fungus that causes this disease was regulated in 2 anti-terrorism laws as a biological weapon for 16 years. Valley fever also has been known to reactivate in patients even decades later, and can be chronic and deadly. The only risk factor worth considering is, do you breathe? If the decision to remove prisoners from these areas was due to the threat to public health, why is the general populace not being warned? After all, informed consent is a keystone of all decision-making, whether people are in a so-called risk group or not. Valley fever survivor often hears from ordinary people who were infected and then left the state because they finally understood how serious the disease is and do not want to subject their children, pets, and other loved ones to it. The state has decided to protect some of its prisoners, but it seems unlikely they are giving the same regard to residents outside the prisons. In a December 2007 letter attempting to appropriate funds for the Valley Fever Vaccine Project, U.S. Representative Kevin McCarthy of California stressed the importance of Valley fever. He mentioned that the disease can be disabling, the drugs frequently fail to treat it, and between 200 and 500 people die annually from Valley fever. Valley fever is caused by the most virulent fungal parasite known to man, was regulated in 2 anti-terrorism laws, and culturing it in a laboratory requires biosafety level 3 protocols and equipment. This is just one step below the level used for the infamous hemorrhagic fever virus Ebola and other contagious diseases capable of causing biological catastrophes. A great deal of money will be spent to relocate prisoners, but no one is paying to relocate the residents who live nearby and in other hyper-endemic areas, much less warn them of the true dangers. So it makes sense that in 2013, prisoners are being moved out from some of the worst Valley fever epidemics. A decade of ongoing death and ruined health for prisoners and prison employees may have made occasional newspaper headlines, but successful lawsuits with big payouts might be what really move bureaucrats to action. No one should have to be subjected to this disease without their knowledge or consent. I feel that everyone in the endemic areas deserves equal respect and should be given the whole Valley fever story. Only then can they decide if they are willing to subject themselves and their families to the risks.